I will say this, I am not a sentimentalman by training. 18 years as the Moorfield Civic Music Society's treasurer will not make you one. You spend 18 years tallying the higher costs of lecture rooms and ordering the right number of Volovan and chasing members who have let their subscriptions lapse, and sentiment tends to get filed somewhere between the petty cash receipts and the unread correspondence. My wife Patricia tells me I have the emotional range of a well-maintained filing cabinet. She means it as affection, I think. I have chosen to believe so. All of which is to say that what I am about to describe is not the report of a man given to exaggeration. The Moorfield Civic Music Society turned 100 years old on the 14th of November, and the centenary gala was held in the Ardlow Assembly Rooms on a cold, clear Thursday evening, as it should have been. 53 members and their guests. The Ardlow's first-floor saloon, with its plasterwork ceiling and its tall Georgian windows and the twin rows of chandeliers that had been rewired in 1987 and never quite threw the same light again. A string quartet for the first hour. Smoked salmon on small triangles of brown bread. A Steinway Model D on a low dais at the far end of the room, its lid raised, its keys uncovered, which had been a point of some discussion with the catering company, who worried about condensation from the chafing dishes. I had organized or co-organized 11 of the Society's previous galas. I knew where every chair belonged. Aldous Prentice had been chairman for 22 of the Society's 100 years, which he mentioned in his speech and which I have no doubt he will mention in his obituary, should he have any say in the matter. He is a tall man, Aldous, with the kind of confidence that accrues in people who have never had occasion to doubt themselves in public. He plays Schubert, after a fashion, at the annual members' recital. He plays it the way a man recites poetry he has memorized without quite understanding. The notes are all there, the meaning has been left on the page. The kitchen staff had been hired through a local catering firm. 4 of them altogether, moving between the saloon and the service corridor with the quiet efficiency of people who have learned to be invisible at other people's celebrations. I noticed the young woman near the piano dais at some point after 9 o'clock, during the lull between the string quartet's final set and the chairman's toast. She was not doing anything in particular. She had set down an empty tray on the service trolley near the wall, and she was standing at the edge of the dais, her back to most of the room, looking at the Steinway. She was perhaps 28. Dark hair pinned back. White catering jacket. Her hands, I noticed when she turned briefly to collect the tray again, were the hands of someone who works with them, reddened at the knuckles, capable looking. She did not touch the piano. She stood very still beside it, as a person stands beside something they have not seen for a very long time and are not sure they have permission to see. She reached out. One finger, her right index finger, rested on the closed lid above the keys. Just the lid. She did not lift it. She withdrew her hand. Aldous saw it. I watched him see it. He was mid-conversation with Geoffrey Hartwell and Geoffrey's wife, and he broke off, not rudely, he was never rude when there was an audience, and turned with the particular broadening of expression that he used when he had identified an opportunity for what he would call good humor. "Go on, then, my dear," he said. His voice carried easily. It always did. "Give us a little tune. Something simple. Something you know." He said it to her, but the pitch of his voice and the angle of his face were for the guests nearest him. Geoffrey smiled. 2 or 3 others turned. The young woman looked at him. Not with defiance. Not with embarrassment. With a kind of stillness I found difficult to interpret. She looked at Aldous for a moment that stretched past comfortable, and then she looked at the piano. She lifted the lid above the keys. She sat down. There was a small sound from somewhere in the room, a half-swallowed laugh, or the anticipation of one. Aldous had already half-turned back to Geoffrey, the smirk ready at the corner of his mouth. She adjusted the bench. 2 turns of the height lever, no more, made with the practiced economy of someone who has performed that adjustment so many times it lives in the muscle rather than the mind. She did not look down at the keys. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, her eyes forward, her posture neither stiff nor relaxed but settled. I will tell you what I noticed in the 2 seconds before she played. The room was not quite quiet. There were still conversations at the far end, a clink of glass, Geoffrey saying something to his wife. The string quartet had left their chairs but not yet packed their cases. One of the other kitchen staff appeared briefly in the service doorway, saw what was happening, and did not move. Then her hands came to the keys. The first note was not loud. That was the first thing. I had half expected something showy, some opening gesture to announce herself. There was nothing of the kind. What she played, the first phrase of what I would later learn was Rachmaninoff's Vocalize, the song without words, the piece written for a human voice and ear transposed for the instrument she had in front of her, entered the room the way a change of weather enters a room when someone opens a window you did not know was closed. Low. Unhurried. A single melodic line. The conversations at the far end did not stop at once. It took 3 or 4 bars. That is the nature of that piece, it does not demand your attention. It earns it. By the time the melody had completed its first arc and curved back into itself, the room was quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience told to hush. The other kind, which is not the absence of sound but the presence of something that has made sound feel inappropriate. Jeffrey was no longer speaking to his wife. Aldous had turned back around. I gripped my program at some point during the first minute. I became aware of this later, when I found the paper creased down the center where my fingers had been. I do not remember deciding to grip it. The hand made its own accounting. What she did with that melody, I am a solicitor by profession, not a musicologist, and I will not pretend to a vocabulary I do not own. What she did was not simply play it. She inhabited it the way you inhabit a grief you have carried long enough that it has become a room you know rather than a wound. There was no display in her playing. No demonstration of technique, no flourish to indicate how well she was managing the difficulty of it. The notes came as though they had always been there and she was simply allowing them to be heard. The piece itself has the quality of something that wants to resolve and cannot. The melodic line reaches and turns back, reaches further and turns back again, each return a little more freighted than the last, until somewhere in the middle of it a phrase arrives that is so open, so genuinely undefended, that the room, our room, that particular room of 53 people in black tie with their champagne and their centenary speeches and their 18-year filing cabinets of sentiment, that room appeared to hold its breath. I noticed the woman on my left when she lifted her hand to her face. She was not, to my knowledge, a person given to public emotion. She was Patricia Gorman, the Society's program editor, who has edited 47 consecutive programs and corrected my punctuation in print more times than I care to enumerate. She pressed the back of her hand briefly beneath her eye and did not otherwise move. 2 seats down from her, a man I did not recognize, a guest, someone's husband, someone who had perhaps come along to the centenary dinner under obligation and expected to be mildly bored, that man put down his glass very carefully and did not pick it up again. The melody reached its final phrase. I will tell you something about the Vocalize that I learned afterwards, which is that it was written without text, without words, because the composer believed some things did not have words. That the voice, or in this case the piano, was sufficient. That the melody itself was the statement. I had not known this when I heard it played. But I think some part of the room understood it anyway, without being told, the way you understand the meaning of a thing someone says in a language you do not speak simply from how they say it. Her hands held the final chord. It lasted a long time, or what felt like a long time, which is not the same thing but is the only measurement I have available. Then it was done. Nothing happened for perhaps 4 seconds. Not applause, not a murmur. The decay of the last chord in that plasterwork room, in those 4 seconds, was the quietest thing I have ever heard. Patricia Gorman began to applaud. Her hands came together and she stood up, and it was the kind of motion that in 18 years of galas and events and concerts I had never seen Patricia Gorman make without apparent advance planning, and the room rose with her, not all at once, not a surge, but one by one, the way people rise when they are quite sure they have to, when they are not doing it because it is expected but because they have no other response available. I stood. I am noting that because I want to be accurate. The young woman, Yeva, I learned her name later, from the catering firm's supervisor, who was herself standing in the service doorway and appeared to be biting the inside of her cheek. Yeva did not look at the room. She lowered the lid back over the keys with the same deliberateness with which she had raised it. She stood, and she moved the bench back to where it had been, and she lifted her empty tray from the service trolley and went back to the kitchen. Aldous Prentice applauded. He was the last one on his feet, and he applauded with his hands held in front of him rather than above his head, and he did not, for once, with the expression of a man who knows exactly what he thinks about everything. I found the catering supervisor during the interval. I asked about the young woman. The supervisor, a practical, spare sort of woman named Mrs. Callender, told me that Yeva had come to England from Georgia 3 years ago and had been with the firm for 14 months. She was a good worker. She was quiet. She did not talk about herself. I asked whether she had trained. Mrs. Callender said she didn't know. She thought there had been a mother. A teacher, perhaps, or someone who had taught her. She thought the mother had died. That was all she could tell me. I went back into the saloon. The string quartet had resumed. The chandeliers were throwing their imperfect light over the glasses and the white tablecloths and the 53 members of the Moorfield Civic Music Society at their centenary. Geoffrey Hartwell was telling someone a story. The Steinway stood on its low dais with its lid closed, the way it had stood before the evening began. I thought about what had happened in that room. A woman had been handed an instrument to provide amusement, by a man who did not consider the possibility that she was capable of anything beyond it. She had sat down. She had played a song without words. She had played it as though every note cost something, and as though she had decided, in that moment, that the cost was one she was prepared to meet. And a room of 53 people, a room that included men and women who had spent their adult lives in the company of music, who could name the key signatures of Brahms and argue about Ravel over dinner, that room had sat in silence as though it had been reminded of something it almost forgot. I am not a sentimental man by training. I have thought about that evening more times than I can account for in any ledger I keep. I think about the way she adjusted the bench before she played, 2 precise turns, no more, the adjustment of someone who has sat at 1,000 instruments and knows her own body's measurements. I think about the moment just before the first note, when her hands were still in her lap and the room had not yet understood what was about to happen. I think about the 4 seconds of silence when it was over, and the way the last chord dissolved into that room of plasterwork and imperfect chandeliers and found, somehow, every corner of it. I think a great deal about a mother who taught her daughter how to sit at a piano the way you teach someone a language, not for examination, not for performance, but because there are things that cannot be said in any other way. That is what I carry out of that room. That, and the program I found afterwards in my jacket pocket, creased down the center, where something in me had known all along,